A lonely farmer took in a homeless boy. Years later, found out he was the son he never knew. The silence in Elias Thorne's life was not a gentle thing. It was a weight, a presence as solid and unyielding as the granite bedrock that lay beneath his 30 acres of fallow soil. For 10 years that silence had been his only companion, his penance, and his shield. It had seeped into the very timbers of his farmhouse, a place where laughter once echoed, replaced now by the groan of settling wood and the sigh of the wind through the eaves. The fields, once vibrant with wheat, now lay dormant, surrendering each season to a stubborn carpet of weeds he no longer had the heart to fight. He worked just enough to survive, his world having shrunk to the size of his own shadow. Each dawn was a chore, each dusk a bitter reminder of what was lost. His wife, Ilara, and their infant son, Samuel, had been stolen by a blizzard a decade ago, swallowed by the unforgiving white wilderness while trying to reach the doctor in the next town over. They were never found, not a trace. And in their absence, Elias had become a ghost in his own life, a man carved from stone and memory, his heart a barren field just like his land. He was a man who had made a vow to feel nothing, for feeling was the door through which agony had first entered. Tonight the silence was different. It was being challenged. A storm, a savage echo of the one that had claimed his world, was hammering against the plains. Rain lashed the windows like flung gravel, and the wind howled a mournful, angry song. It was on a night like this that all his ghosts walked freely, but this time they were not alone. A sound, faint but sharp, cut through the gale, a splintering crack from the direction of his barn. It was not the sound of the storm, it was the sound of intrusion. Elias, moving with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who conserves all energy, took the old Winchester from its hooks above the fireplace. He did not feel fear, only a dull, weary anger. Whatever it was, a coyote, a vagrant, a thief, it had violated the sanctity of his solitude. He pulled on his heavy coat, the fabric stiff and cold, and stepped out into the roaring dark. The rain hit him instantly, a physical blow. Shielding his eyes, he trudged toward the barn, the mud sucking at his boots. The main door was barred from the outside, just as he had left it. He circled around to the small side door, the one with the broken latch he'd never bothered to fix. It was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, the Winchester held ready, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp hay and livestock long gone. He raised the lantern he'd brought, its yellow light cutting a nervous swath through the cavernous dark. And that's when he saw it. Not a coyote, not a thief. Curled into a tight ball in the corner of an empty stall, hidden behind a rotting trough, was a child. A boy, no older than 8 or 9, his clothes little more than rags, his hair plastered to his skull by the rain. He was shivering, not just from cold, but from a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air around him. The boy's eyes, wide and dark in his pale, thin face, were fixed on the rifle. He didn't make a sound, didn't cry out. He just watched, his body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt into a night that would surely kill him. Elias stood there, frozen, the rain dripping from his hat. For the first time in 10 years, the silence in his soul was utterly and completely shattered. The world, which he had so carefully locked out, had just broken into his barn and was staring at him with the eyes of a terrified child. Every instinct, honed by a decade of loss and isolation, screamed at him to turn around, to bar the door, to let the world deal with its own. But then the boy flinched as a clap of thunder shook the barn to its foundations, and in that flinch, Elias saw not a stranger, not a problem, but a terror he knew in his own bones. The choice was not a choice. It was a reckoning. What do you do when the one thing you've sworn to avoid, a connection, a vulnerability, is shivering in your barn looking at you as if you are both God and the executioner? The lonely farmer lowered the rifle, the heavy barrel dipping toward the dirt floor. It was the heaviest thing he had ever done. The boy did not move. His gaze remained locked on Elias, a wild creature's stare, assessing, waiting for the killing blow or the inexplicable act of mercy. Elias took a slow step forward, his boots crunching softly on the hay-strewn floor. He kept his movements small, deliberate, the way one would approach a spooked colt. The lantern light flickered, casting their shadows long and distorted against the weathered planks of the barn wall. The farmer's shadow was a giant, a looming monster. The boy's was a crumpled thing, barely there at all. Elias stopped about 10 feet away. He knew that to the child he was a threat, a large, grim-faced man holding a weapon. He leaned the Winchester carefully against the stall post, a clear gesture of peace. Still, the boy didn't relax. His small frame was rigid with a tension that seemed too large for his body to contain. Elias cleared his throat, his voice a rough, unused thing. "You're trespassing," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. They were not the right words, but they were the only ones that came. The boy flinched at the sound, pressing himself further into the corner, making himself smaller. He didn't speak. He just watched. Elias tried again, forcing a softer tone, a tone he hadn't used since he'd last spoken to Ilera. "The storm's a bad one. No place for a person to be out." Silence. The only answer was the drumming of the rain on the tin roof and the boy's ragged, shallow breaths. Elias could see him more clearly now. He was painfully thin, his cheekbones sharp beneath the grime on his face. He had a bruise, dark and ugly along his jaw. This was not a child who had simply lost his way. This was a child who was running from something. The farmer felt a familiar, unwelcome pang in his chest. It was pity, a dangerous emotion. Pity was the seed of caring, and caring was the seed of pain. He had spent a decade poisoning that soil, so nothing could grow. He should turn around. He should go back to the house, lock the door, and let the morning solve the problem. The boy would be gone by dawn, another piece of driftwood on the relentless current of a harsh world. It was not his concern, but his feet remained planted on the barn floor. He thought of Samuel, his Samuel, who would have been about this boy's age. A ghost of a thought, a flicker of a memory, so sharp it stole his breath. Would he have wanted some stranger to turn his back on his son, shivering and alone in a storm? The question was an accusation, a betrayal of the vow of numbness he had made to himself. He was breaking his own rules. The silence stretched, becoming a battlefield between the man he had become and the man he once was. The man he was now was a survivor, a hermit who had purchased peace at the price of his own humanity. The man he had been was a husband, a father, a man who would have moved heaven and earth for a child. In the end, it was the boy's silence that defeated him. It was a silence born not of defiance, but of absolute terror. He had no words because words had likely failed him, or been used against him, time and time again. Elias let out a long, slow breath, a sound of surrender. "I have a fire in the house," he said, his voice quiet, "and stew." He didn't ask the boy to come. He didn't command him, he just stated it as a fact. A fire exists, food exists. It was an invitation without the pressure of a question. He waited a moment longer, then turned his back on the boy, an act of profound trust, and walked slowly toward the barn door, leaving the lantern on the floor, its small circle of light a beacon in the oppressive dark. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He just walked, counting his steps, each one a betrayal of his grief and a step toward something he could not yet name. He reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped back into the raging storm, leaving the choice and the light entirely up to the boy. Elias did not go straight back to the house. He stood in the rain for a long moment, the cold water washing over his face, trying to rinse away the feeling that was blooming in his chest. It felt like a thaw, a painful cracking of ice that had been frozen for a decade. He was angry with himself, angry for his weakness, for letting a pair of wide, dark eyes dismantle the fortress he had so carefully constructed around his heart. He had offered shelter. He had offered food. He had done more than enough. Now he had to retreat, to rebuild his walls. He returned to the house, the wet wool of his coat smelling of the storm. He shut the door, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. He dripped water onto the floorboards, but he didn't care. He walked to the fireplace, the embers glowing a dull orange. He poked them back to life, the flames leaping up, hungry. He ladled a bowl of the venison stew he'd made yesterday, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. He had intended to leave it on the table, a silent offering in case the boy found the courage to follow. But as he held the warm bowl, His resolve wavered. This was a mistake. He was inviting complication into a life he had purposefully simplified to the point of monastic emptiness. He set the bowl down on the table with a thud, his own supper forgotten. He paced the small room, a caged animal. His gaze fell upon the one photograph he allowed himself to keep. It was on the mantelpiece, tucked behind an old clock. It was of Ilara. Her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, a smile that had been the center of his universe. He had no pictures of Samuel. The boy had been too young, his life too brief. There was only the aching void where those pictures should have been. Looking at Ilara's face, a wave of guilt washed over him. Was he betraying her memory by helping this strange child, or was he betraying it by hesitating? What would she have done? The answer was immediate and absolute. She would have already been in the barn, wrapping the boy in every blanket she owned, her voice a low, soothing murmur, her presence a shield against the storm and whatever horrors he was fleeing. The thought was so clear, so quintessentially her, that it felt like she was standing right there beside him. The thought shamed him. He had become a creature she would not recognize. He looked back at the door, at the stew cooling on the table. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He listened, but the only sound was the storm. The boy was not coming. A strange mix of relief and disappointment settled in Elias's gut. It was for the best. He had offered. The boy had refused. His duty was done. He could go back to his silence, back to his ghosts. He picked up his own bowl of stew and sat at the table, forcing himself to eat. The food was tasteless, ashes in his mouth. He was halfway through the bowl when he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost lost beneath the wind's shriek, a soft, hesitant scratching at the door. Elias froze, his spoon hovering over the bowl. He wasn't sure he had heard it at all. Maybe it was a branch, or the wind playing tricks. Then it came again, more insistent this time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the sound of a small hand, too afraid to knock. He put the spoon down. The fortress he had just tried to rebuild crumbled into dust. He rose from his chair and walked to the door, his heart, a thing he had thought long dead, thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He pulled back the heavy iron latch and opened the door. The boy stood on the threshold, a small, drenched silhouette, against the raging dark. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, his face pale and luminous in the light from the house. He didn't look up. He stared at Elias's boots, as if awaiting a verdict. He had come. He had chosen the uncertain mercy of a stranger over the certain death of the storm. And with that single, silent act of desperate hope, the boy walked into Elias Thorne's life, and the world for the farmer, whether he wanted it to or not, began again. The boy stood dripping on the welcome mat, a small puddle forming around his worn-out shoes. He kept his head bowed, his posture a study in submission. Elias stepped back, holding the door open wider. "In," he said, the word rough but not unkind. "Before you catch your death." The boy shuffled inside, moving with a cautious, sideways gait, as if expecting a blow at any moment. He hugged himself tightly, his arms wrapped around his own thin torso. Elias shut the door, plunging the room into a warm, fire-lit intimacy that felt both strange and overwhelming. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was an expectant silence, filled with the presence of another human being. It was a silence that demanded to be broken. "Take off those wet things," Elias instructed, gesturing to the boy's sodden rags. He turned away to give the boy a semblance of privacy, busying himself by adding another log to the fire. He heard a soft rustling of cloth, the sound of wet fabric peeling from cold skin. When he turned back, the boy stood in his threadbare underclothes, a small pile of wet rags at his feet. He was even thinner than Elias had thought, his ribs starkly visible, his skin covered in a roadmap of old bruises and faint scars. A fresh wave of anger, cold and sharp, went through Elias, not at the boy, but at the world that had done this to him. "There's a blanket on the chair," Elias said, his voice tight. He pointed to a thick wool blanket draped over a rocking chair by the fire. The boy scurried over, wrapped the heavy blanket around his small shoulders, and huddled on the hearth, as close to the flames as he could get without being burned. He still hadn't looked Elias in the eye. Elias picked up the bowl of stew from the table. It was lukewarm now, but it would be hot enough. He held it out. "Here." The boy looked at the bowl, then up at Elias's face for the first time. His eyes were deep and dark, filled with a caution that was ancient and heartbreaking in one so young. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between the food and the man. It was a test of trust. Was the food real? Was it a trick? Elias held the bowl steady, his expression unchanging. He simply waited. Finally, with a trembling hand, the boy reached out and took the bowl. He cradled it in his lap, the warmth seeming to seep into his very bones. He didn't have a spoon, and Elias had forgotten to give him one. The boy didn't seem to notice or care. He bent his head and began to eat with his fingers, scooping up the meat and vegetables with a desperate, animal-like hunger. He ate quickly, messily, his eyes never leaving the bowl, as if afraid it would be snatched away. Elias watched him, a knot tightening in his throat. He had seen starving dogs eat with more dignity. This child hadn't had a proper meal in a very long time. The farmer turned and retrieved a spoon from a drawer, along with a piece of stale bread. He walked back and placed them quietly on the hearth beside the boy. The boy flinched at his approach, but didn't stop eating. He ignored the spoon, but grabbed the bread and used it to sop up the last of the gravy, cleaning the bowl with a meticulousness that spoke volumes about his hunger. When he was finished, he set the empty bowl down and looked into the fire. The blanket clutched tightly around him. The warmth and the food were beginning to work their magic. The violent shivering had subsided, and a little color had returned to his cheeks. He looked safe. The word echoed in Elias's mind. Safe. It was not a word he had associated with his home for a very long time. His home was a tomb, a memorial. It was not a sanctuary. Yet, here was this child, finding refuge within its walls. Elias sat down in the rocking chair, the one that had been Alera's. It creaked under his weight. He hadn't sat in it for years. "What's your name, boy?" he asked, his voice low. The boy didn't respond. He continued to stare into the flames as if he hadn't heard. Elias waited, then asked again, "Do you have a name?" The boy gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was an answer, but not to the question Elias had asked. He wasn't saying he didn't have a name, he was saying he wouldn't give it. Elias fell silent. He would not push. The boy was a locked box, and Elias knew he had no right to try and force it open. For now it was enough that he was warm, fed, and out of the storm. That night Elias gave the boy the bed in the spare room, a room that had been silent and empty for 10 years. He watched as the child, still wrapped in the blanket, climbed onto the mattress and curled into a ball, his back to the door. Elias stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the blanket. A child was sleeping in his house. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Before he closed the door, he spoke one last time into the quiet room. "The name's Elias," he said. "You're safe here." He didn't know if the boy was awake to hear him. He didn't know if the words were true, but he said them anyway. A promise made to a nameless child and to the ghosts that haunted the silent corners of his home. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale morning sun. Elias was up before dawn, moving with the quiet efficiency of long habit. He lit the stove, put on a pot of coffee, and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of wet earth and pine. The damage from the storm was minimal, a few downed branches, a loose shutter on the barn. The world felt new, scrubbed raw. It felt like a beginning. He returned to the house, the familiar silence of his morning routine feeling different, charged with anticipation. He glanced at the closed door of the spare room. Was the boy still there? Or had he vanished with the darkness, a figment of a storm-tossed night? Part of him, the part that craved the safety of his solitude, hoped the boy was gone. But another part, a part he was only just beginning to acknowledge, felt a tremor of anxiety at the thought. He made breakfast. Fried eggs, bacon, and thick slices of bread. The smell filled the small house, a warm, inviting aroma that spoke of home and normalcy. He set 2 plates on the table, then hesitated. He had not set a second plate at this table in 10 years. The simple act felt monumental, a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of his existence. He was about to knock on the spare room door when it creaked open. The boy stood there, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He was wearing the old too-large shirt and trousers Elias had left out for him, the sleeves and cuffs rolled up multiple times. The clothes, which had belonged to Elias in his youth, swallowed the boy's small frame, making him look even more fragile and lost. He looked at the table, at the 2 plates of food, and his eyes widened slightly. He had stayed. Elias gestured to the chair with his chin. "Eat," he said. The boy moved to the table with the same caution as the night before, his movements tentative. He sat on the edge of the chair, his back straight, and began to eat. This time he used the fork Elias had set out, his motions still quick and furtive, but less desperate. They ate in silence. It was not the oppressive silence of Elias's grief, nor the tense silence of last night's fear. It was a new kind of silence, an exploratory one, like 2 solitary animals cautiously sharing a waterhole. When they were finished, Elias took the plates to the sink. The boy remained at the table, his hands in his lap. "I've got chores," Elias said, not looking at him. "You can stay or you can go. It's your choice. There's a road a mile east of here. It'll take you to town. Someone there might be able to help you." He was offering the boy an out. He was offering himself an out. It was a test. Would the boy take the easy path, back to the world he knew, or would he choose to stay in this strange, quiet place with this grim, silent man? Elias went outside, not waiting for an answer. He began his work mending the fence where a heavy branch had fallen. The work was familiar, grounding. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer was a comfort. He worked for an hour, his back to the house, forcing himself not to look. He told himself he didn't care what the boy chose. But he was lying. Every nerve was stretched, listening for the sound of the front door opening and closing, for the sight of a small figure walking away down the long dirt driveway. But the sound never came. When he finally allowed himself to glance back at the house, he saw the boy. He was sitting on the top step of the porch, watching him. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, a small, still figure in the vastness of the landscape. He had not left. He had chosen to stay. A feeling that Elias couldn't name, a complex mixture of dread and a strange, fierce gladness settled in his chest. The boy was still a mystery, a locked box. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But he had made a choice. He had chosen the barn in the storm, and now he had chosen the porch in the sun. For the first time in a very long time, Elias Thorne was not entirely alone. The silence had been broken, and now so had the solitude. The boy stayed on the porch all day, a silent observer to Elias's chores. He watched Elias chop wood, clear the fallen branches, and repair the loose shutter on the barn. He was a constant, quiet presence at the edge of Elias's vision, and Elias, in turn, was acutely aware of him. It was a strange, unspoken dance. Days turned into a week. A routine began to form. Elias would wake, make breakfast for 2, and go about his work. The boy, who remained nameless, would eat and then follow Elias at a distance. He never offered to help, and Elias never asked him to. The boy was a shadow, a satellite orbiting the lonely planet of Elias's life. He still did not speak, not a single word. Elias tried at first. He would ask simple questions. "Are you hungry? Are you warm enough?" The boy would respond with a nod or a shake of his head, but never with his voice. After a while, Elias stopped asking. He learned to read the boy's needs in his posture, in the subtle shifts of his expression. He learned that a certain stillness meant he was tired, that a slight widening of the eyes meant he was interested in something. They communicated in a language of silence, a language Elias had become fluent in over the years. One afternoon, Elias was in the small workshop behind the house, sharpening an axe. The boy was sitting on a stump just outside the door, watching the sparks fly from the grinding wheel. Elias's hand slipped, and the axe head grazed his knuckle, opening a small but deep cut. He swore under his breath, dropping the axe and clutching his hand. Blood welled up, dark and red. Before Elias could even move to get a rag, the boy was there. He had shot up from the stump and was standing beside him, his eyes wide with concern. He looked at the bleeding hand, then darted back outside. He returned a moment later, his hands full of broad green leaves. Elias recognized them as yarrow. The boy crushed the leaves between his small fingers. Then, with a surprising gentleness, He pressed the poultice onto Elias's wound. Elias stared, astonished. The boy held the leaves in place, his small, cool fingers surprisingly steady against Elias's calloused skin. He looked up at Elias, his dark eyes serious and focused. It was the most intimate contact they had ever had. After a moment, the boy let go. The bleeding had already slowed. Elias looked from his hand to the boy's face. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice soft. The boy just looked at him, his expression unreadable, then retreated back to his stump, his brief foray into action complete. He had not spoken, but he had acted. He had shown knowledge, he had shown care. The locked box had opened, just a crack. That evening, as Elias was banking the fire for the night, he made a decision. He couldn't keep calling him boy in his own mind. It was not a name, it was a label. He looked over at the child, who was dozing by the hearth, the firelight flickering on his face. He needed a name, a temporary one at least. Elias thought for a moment. He remembered a book Ilara used to read, a book of old names and their meanings. There was one she had liked, Leo. It meant lion. She had said it was a name for someone with a strong heart. He looked at the small, silent boy, a child who had survived horrors Elias couldn't imagine, who had walked out of a storm and into his life, who had tended his wound with a gentle confidence. A lion's heart indeed. "Leo," Elias said, testing the name in the quiet room. "I'm going to call you Leo." The boy's eyes opened. He looked at Elias, a flicker of something in their depths. He didn't nod, he didn't smile, but he didn't look away. He just held Elias's gaze for a long moment, and for the first time Elias felt he was not just looking at a nameless, homeless boy, he was looking at Leo. The name settled between them, a bridge across the silence. Elias started using it, and the boy, Leo, began to respond to it. A turn of the head, a glance, a subtle acknowledgement that he was being seen as a person. The invisible wall between them began to crumble, brick by silent brick. Leo started to venture closer during chores. He would hand Elias a tool without being asked, or hold a piece of wood steady. He was learning the rhythms of the farm, anticipating Elias's needs. He was making himself useful, earning his keep in a currency of small, helpful acts. The farm, too, began to change. With another pair of hands, however small, the work felt less overwhelming. Elias found himself clearing another patch of the fallow field. The thought of planting a small vegetable garden, something he hadn't done in years, entering his mind. He was doing it for Leo, he told himself. A boy needed fresh vegetables. But he knew, deep down, he was also doing it for himself. The presence of the boy was waking parts of him he thought were long dead. The town, however, was not so easily won over. Once a month, Elias would ride into the small settlement of dusty streets and suspicious eyes to buy supplies. On his first trip with Leo, the reaction was immediate. People stared. They whispered behind their hands. Martha, the grocer's wife and the town's primary source of gossip, was direct. "Whose boy is that, Elias?" she asked, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. Elias's hand rested protectively on Leo's shoulder. "He's with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Just some supplies, Marta." But the questions followed them down the street. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable with a lazy demeanor that hid a stubborn curiosity, stopped him outside the feed store. "That the boy folks are talking about? The one you found?" "He's not found," Elias said, his voice cold. "He's staying with me." "For how long?" Gable pressed. "That's my business. A boy needs a name, a family. He got either?" Elias looked down at Leo, who was staring at the ground, trying to make himself invisible. He felt a surge of fierce, primal protectiveness. "His name is Leo," he said, the name feeling solid and real on his tongue. "And right now, I'm all the family he needs." The sheriff grunted, unconvinced. "Folks are worried, Elias. A strange boy shows up out of nowhere. It ain't right." "What's not right?" Elias retorted, his voice low and dangerous. "Is a town full of folks who'd rather let a child starve in a storm than offer him a roof. Now, if you'll excuse us." He guided Leo away, his hand firm on his shoulder. He could feel the boy trembling. The town's suspicion was a palpable thing, a poison in the air. As they rode home, Leo was more silent and withdrawn than ever. The fragile trust that had been building between them felt as if it had been bruised. That night, a new tension settled in the small farmhouse. The outside world, with its questions and its judgments, had intruded upon their quiet sanctuary. Elias found himself watching the road more often, a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was not just protecting the boy from the memory of whatever he had fled. He was now protecting him from the prying eyes of his neighbors. A few days later, the threat became more concrete. A fancy carriage, a rare sight in these parts, kicked up a cloud of dust as it rolled down Elias's long driveway. Elias, who was splitting logs, stopped his work, the axe held loosely in his hand. Leo, who was stacking the wood, froze, his eyes wide with a familiar terror. A man in a tailored suit and a bowler hat stepped out of the carriage. He was slick and well-fed, with a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Thorne?" he asked, his voice smooth as oil. "I'm Mr. Alistair, from the county orphanage." Elias's grip tightened on the axe handle. "I've no business with the orphanage." "Well, business has come to you, I'm afraid," Elias said, his gaze flicking over to Leo, who had backed away and was now hiding behind Elias. "We've had reports of a runaway child residing on your property. A ward of the county. I'm here to collect him." Elias stepped in front of Leo, shielding him completely. "The boy is under my care." "That's very charitable of you," Alistair said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But it's also illegal. The boy, Leo, as I believe you call him, belongs with us. He needs proper supervision, education, not the company of a reclusive farmer." The man's condescending tone scraped Elias's nerves raw. He knew this wasn't about the boy's welfare. It was about authority, about possession. Alistair represented the world that had hurt this child, and now it had come to claim him back. "Hem stays here," Elias said, his voice flat and hard as iron. Alistair's smile vanished. "Mr. Thorne, you are harboring a fugitive. I have the law on my side. Sheriff Gable is aware of my visit. If you do not hand the boy over peacefully, I will return with him, and you will be charged with kidnapping. Do you understand?" The ultimatum hung in the air between them, sharp and deadly. Elias looked from the smug, confident face of Alistair to the terror in Leo's eyes. He was being asked to make another choice. Give up the boy and return to the safety of his solitude, or declare war on the world to protect a child who was not his, a child who had brought nothing but complication and trouble to his door. But as he looked at Leo, he realized it wasn't trouble the boy had brought. It was life. It was purpose. The choice was no choice at all. He had lowered a rifle for this boy. He would certainly raise an axe for him. "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Now." Alistair's face, a mask of smug condescension, tightened with genuine surprise and then anger. He was not a man accustomed to being defied, especially by someone he considered a rustic hermit. "You are making a grave mistake, Thorne," he hissed, his polished veneer cracking. "I will be back, and when I am, the full weight of the law will come down on you and this farm." He shot a venomous glare at Leo, who flinched as if struck. Alistair then turned on his heel, climbed back into his fine carriage, and departed in a cloud of indignant dust, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. Elias stood motionless for a long time, the axe still in his hand, his knuckles white. The threat was real. He had openly defied a county official. Sheriff Gable, for all his laziness, was a man who followed the path of least resistance, and Alistair was a man who could create a great deal of resistance. He was exposed. They were exposed. He finally lowered the axe and turned to Leo. The boy was staring at him, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of terror and something else, something that looked almost like awe. He had seen Elias stand up for him, a shield against the world. It was a new experience for him. Elias's heart ached. He knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "He won't take you," Elias said, his voice raw with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "I won't let him." For the first time, Leo did not retreat. He took a small, hesitant step forward. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the sleeve of Elias's shirt, a silent gesture of thanks, of allegiance. It was more eloquent than any word. That night, the farmhouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a besieged outpost. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, sounded like the approach of the sheriff. Elias didn't sleep. He sat in Alara's rocking chair, the Winchester across his lap, and watched the moonlit path to his door. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a guardian. He was a sentry. He was protecting his home, and the boy who had, against all odds, made it a home again. The next few days were fraught with tension. Elias and Leo worked with a silent, feverish intensity, shoring up the farm, reinforcing fences, checking the locks on the doors and windows. It was a practical response, but it was also a way of fighting back against the feeling of helplessness. They were preparing for a siege. During this time, something shifted in Leo. The constant threat, instead of making him more withdrawn, seemed to be forging a new kind of strength in him. He was no longer just a passive observer. He was a partner. He worked alongside Elias, his small face set with a fierce determination. The silence between them remained, but it was now a comfortable, collaborative silence. The silence of two soldiers in a trench who understand each other without needing to speak. One evening, after a long day of work, they were sitting by the fire. Leo had been quiet, even for him, a thoughtful look on his face. He was holding a small, smooth stone in his hand, rubbing it with his thumb. Elias had seen him with the stone before. It was one of the few possessions the boy seemed to have. Suddenly, Leo looked up from the fire and met Elias's gaze. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a brief struggle playing out on his face. Elias waited, his heart suddenly still. Leo took a breath, and then, in a voice that was small and raspy from disuse, he spoke his first word. "Why?" The single word was a thunderclap in the quiet room. Elias was so stunned, he wasn't sure he had heard it correctly. He stared at the boy, who was looking at him with an intense, questioning gaze. "Why?" Leo repeated, his voice a little stronger this time. Elias understood. Why stand up for him? Why defy Alistair? Why risk everything for a nameless, homeless boy? Elias leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked into the boy's earnest, searching eyes. He had to give him an honest answer. "Because," Elias said, his own voice thick with emotion, "this is your home, and you don't let people take your family." He had said it without thinking. Family. The word hung in the air between them, momentous and terrifying and beautiful. He had claimed the boy, not just to the world but to himself. Leo stared at him, his lips parted slightly. He processed the word, the immensity of it. Then a small, slow smile spread across his face. It was the first time Elias had ever seen him smile. It was like the sun breaking through a decade of clouds. It lit up his whole face, chasing away the shadows of fear and sorrow. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated hope. And in that moment, Elias knew that whatever came, whatever fight Elias and the law brought to his door, he had already won the only battle that mattered. The silence was not just broken. It was defeated, and in its place something new and fragile and incredibly strong was beginning to grow. The smile was a beginning. The word was a key. With the dam of silence broken, a small trickle of words began to flow from Leo. They were hesitant at first, single words and short, fractured phrases. He spoke of hunger, of cold, of running. He didn't offer a narrative, just disconnected snapshots of a life spent in the shadows. Elias never pushed for more. He listened, providing a safe harbor for the boy's painful memories to surface. He learned that Leo had been in Alistair's orphanage, a place of cold beds and colder hearts. He had run away not once, but several times, preferring the dangers of the wilderness to the institutional cruelty of that place. The bruise on his jaw, long faded, had come from an overseer's hand. Each revelation was a small, sharp blow to Elias's heart, reinforcing his determination to protect the boy. The threat of Alistair's return loomed over them, a constant low-grade fear. But in the face of it, the bond between the man and the boy solidified. They were a unit, a family forged in crisis. The farm became their entire world. They planted the vegetable garden, their hands working together in the rich, dark earth. For Elias, turning the soil that had lain fallow for so long felt like a form of prayer, an act of faith in the future. For the first time in 10 years, he was planting for someone other than himself. He was planting for his son. He didn't say the word aloud again, but it lived in his heart, a warm and steady flame. One afternoon, while clearing out a corner of the barn, Leo made a discovery. Tucked away in an old feed sack was a small wooden box. Elias recognized it instantly. It was Ilara's memory box, a place where she had kept her small treasures. He hadn't been able to bring himself to open it since she had disappeared. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a few precious items. A dried wildflower from their first picnic, a ribbon from her hair, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Elias picked up the bird, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of its wings. He had carved it for her on the eve of their wedding, a promise of a home and a future. A wave of grief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. Leo, seeing the look on his face, came closer. He peered into the box, his eyes wide with curiosity. Then he gasped. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small object. He held it out on the palm of his hand. It was another wooden bird. It was cruder, more worn, its features softened by time and constant handling. But it was unmistakably the same design, a mirror image of the bird in Elias's hand. Elias stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It was impossible. "Where?" Elias whispered, his voice hoarse. "Where did you get this?" Leo looked from the bird in his hand to the one in Elias's. "Mama," he said, the words soft and clear. Elias's world tilted on its axis. "Your mama gave this to you?" Leo nodded. She said Papa made it for her." The barn seemed to shrink around Elias, the air growing thick and heavy. He couldn't breathe. He looked at Leo, truly looked at him, searching his small, familiar face for something he had never thought to look for before. The dark eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way his hair curled just behind his ears. He saw it. He saw her. He saw Ilara in the boy's face. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A cruel, impossible coincidence. His mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation. "Your mother," Elias said, his voice shaking. "What was her name?" "Ilara," Leo said quietly. The name, her name, from the boy's lips, struck Elias like a physical blow. He staggered back, his hand coming up to brace himself against a wooden post. The barn spun around him. 10 years. 10 years of grief, of silence, of believing they were gone, dead, lost to the snow. It had all been a lie, a terrible, decade-long lie. Ilara had survived, and Samuel, his son, Samuel had survived. He was standing right in front of him. He was no longer just Leo, the homeless boy he had taken in. He was Samuel, his son, the son he had mourned for a third of his life. The revelation was not a gentle dawn. It was a lightning strike, a cataclysm that shattered his world and rebuilt it in a single, blinding instant. All the small moments, the unspoken connections, the feeling of familiarity, it all coalesced into a truth so immense and overwhelming that he couldn't bear it. He looked at the boy, at Samuel, and saw not a stranger he had grown to love, but a son he had never stopped loving. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, streamed down his face, the first tears he had shed in 10 years. They were tears of grief for the lost time, for the woman he had loved and lost twice now, but they were also tears of a profound, earth-shattering joy. He had found him. After a decade of wandering in the wilderness of his sorrow, his son had come home. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Elias sank to his knees on the dusty floor of the barn, the 2 wooden birds, one in his hand, one in Leo's, in Samuel's, a testament to a truth that defied all reason. The boy, his son, watched him, his young face a mask of confusion and concern. He did not understand the storm that had just broken inside the man who had given him shelter. "Papa?" The word was a question, hesitant and fragile. He had heard his mother use it when she spoke of the man who made the bird. He was trying it on, seeing if it fit this weeping, broken man. The sound of that word, a word Elias never thought he would hear, cut through his shock. He looked up at Samuel, his vision blurred by tears. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the boy's face, his fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheek. It was real. This was his son. "Samuel," Elias breathed, the name a prayer. "Your name is Samuel." The boy's eyes widened. He had been called Leo for so long, and before that nothing at all. To hear this name, a name that felt both strange and deeply familiar, was another shock. "My name." "Yes," Elias said, his voice thick. "I named you. Your mother and I. We named you Samuel." He pulled the boy into his arms, holding him tightly, burying his face in his small shoulder. He was overwhelmed by the scent of hay and boy, the feeling of his son's small, solid body in his arms. He was real. He was alive. After a decade of mourning a ghost, he was holding his own flesh and blood. Samuel, startled at first by the sudden, fierce embrace, slowly relaxed. He wrapped his own small arms around Elias's neck, a gesture of acceptance, of coming home. They stayed like that for a long time, a father and son reunited in a dusty barn, the afternoon sun slanting through the gaps in the boards, illuminating them in a sacred light. When Elias finally pulled back, he looked into his son's eyes. There were 1,000 questions he wanted to ask. Where had Ilara been all this time? How did she survive? Why did she never come back? But those were questions for later. For now, there was only one thing that mattered. "She's gone, isn't she?" Elias asked, his heart aching with a new, fresh grief for the woman he had lost all over again. Samuel nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "A sickness. Last winter." He pulled something else from his pocket, a small, tattered piece of cloth wrapped around a smooth gray stone. He unfolded the cloth. Elias recognized it instantly. It was a piece of Ilara's shawl, and embroidered on it were her initials, E.T. The stone was the one he had given her when he proposed, taken from the banks of the river where they had met. She said, "Find the man with the bird," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling. "She said he would keep me safe." Ilara had not abandoned him. She had been trying to get back to him. She had spent the last years of her life protecting their son, filling his head with stories of his father, the man who carved birds and built homes, and sending him on a final, desperate journey to find the only sanctuary she had ever known. The grief was immense, a vast, dark ocean. But for the first time, it was not a lonely grief. He was not mourning alone. He was sharing this sorrow with his son. He held Samuel's small hand, his large calloused fingers wrapping around the boy's. "She was right," Elias said, his voice steady now, filled with a resolve of forged steel. "I will keep you safe. No one is ever taking you away from me." This was not just a promise to a child, it was a vow. It was the rekindling of a covenant he had made to his wife 10 years ago. He was a father again, and he would burn the world to the ground before he let anyone harm his son. The shadow of Mr. Allister and the law still loomed, but it seemed smaller now, less significant. Before, he had been fighting for a principle, for a boy he cared about. Now he was fighting for his own blood. The stakes were no longer just his farm or his freedom. The stakes were his soul. The days that followed the revelation were a strange and sacred time. The farmhouse, once a monument to loss, became a house of reclamation. Elias and Samuel, the name now feeling natural and right, began the slow, careful work of piecing together a decade of lost time. Samuel's stories, once fragmented, began to form a coherent, heartbreaking narrative. After the blizzard, a half-frozen Ilara, clutching her infant son, had been found by a traveling group of homesteaders. They were kind people, but they were heading west, away from the life she knew. With no memory of how she'd gotten lost and suffering from a head injury that clouded her thoughts, she had no choice but to go with them. She had spent years moving, always looking for a way back, her memories returning in painful flashes. She had raised Samuel on stories of his father, the strong, kind farmer waiting for them, making the man a legend in the boy's mind. The carved bird was his only tangible link to this mythical father. After Ilara's death, Samuel had been found by the authorities and sent to Alias orphanage, a place from which he had immediately fled, clutching his mother's last words and his wooden bird, and heading east, guided by an instinct he didn't understand. He was looking for a man, a farm, a home. Elias listened to it all, his heart a painful mix of sorrow and pride. Sorrow for Elias' long struggle, and pride for her incredible strength and resilience. She had kept their son alive. She had sent him home. In return, Elias shared his own stories of the quiet, empty years. He spoke of the silence, the grief, And the day a small, terrified boy had appeared in his barn, bringing with him a light he thought had been extinguished forever. They were two survivors, a father and a son, each telling the story of how they had navigated the wilderness to find each other. The work on the farm took on a new meaning. It was no longer about defense. It was about building a future. They planted rows of corn and beans, repaired the roof of the house, and, for the first time in a decade, Elias opened up Ilara's room. Together, they aired it out, cleaned away the dust, and made it a room for Samuel. It was not an act of replacement, but of continuation. One morning, as they were eating breakfast, Samuel asked a question that had been hovering between them. "Are you scared of the man from the orphanage?" Elias looked at his son, at the worry in his dark eyes. He reached across the table and placed his hand over Samuel's. "I'm not scared," he said, and he was surprised to find that it was the truth. "I'm ready." The fear had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He knew a confrontation was inevitable. Alistair was not a man to let an insult go unanswered. It was only a matter of time. The time came a week later. Two riders appeared on the horizon, their approach kicking up a telltale plume of dust. It was Sheriff Gable and Mr. Alistair. Elias saw them coming from a mile off. He sent Samuel into the house. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Samuel nodded, his face pale but resolute, and ran inside. Elias did not get his rifle. He walked to the edge of his property, his feet planted firmly on his own land, and waited. He stood by the fence he and his son had just mended, his hands resting on the top rail. He would meet them not as a cornered animal, but as a landowner, a father defending his home. Alistair dismounted, his face a thunderous mask of self-righteous fury. Sheriff Gable remained on his horse, looking uncomfortable, his gaze shifting anywhere but at Elias. "Thorn!" Alistair bellowed. "Your time is up. I have a court order for the boy. Hand him over now, or Sheriff Gable will arrest you for obstruction of justice and kidnapping." He brandished a piece of paper, a weapon in his hand. Elias's gaze remained steady. He didn't even look at the paper. "The boy's name is Samuel Thorn," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the still air. "He is my son. He is home. He is not going anywhere." Alistair let out a short, ugly laugh. "Your son? That's a pathetic and desperate lie. The boy is an orphan, a ward of the county." "He is my son," Elias repeated, his voice unwavering. "My wife was Ilara Thorn. She and my son were lost in the blizzard of '68. We all thought they were dead. We were wrong. My wife died last winter. My son Samuel has come home." Sheriff Gable shifted on his horse, his eyes widening. He remembered the Thorn tragedy. Everyone in the county did. It was a local legend, a cautionary tale. "This is absurd," Alistair sneered, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "You have no proof." "I have all the proof I need," Elias said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small carved bird. He held it up for them to see. "I carved this for my wife." The boy had a matching one, given to him by his mother. He then pulled out the tattered piece of cloth with Ilara's initials. "And this, which I'm sure some of the older women in town will recognize as a piece of Ilara's favorite shawl." He looked directly at Sheriff Gable, whose face had gone pale. "You knew Ilara, Sheriff. You know this is the truth. Look at the boy. You will see her in his face." Alistair was sputtering, his confidence draining away. "This is a trick, a fabrication. Sheriff, arrest this man." But Gable was no longer looking at Alistair. He was looking at Elias, at the fierce, undeniable truth in his eyes. He was looking at the farmhouse, and he was remembering the vibrant young couple who had lived there. He was a lazy man, but he was not an evil one. He knew the difference between a desperate lie and a truth that could shake the foundations of the world. He had a choice to make: uphold the letter of the law as represented by a vindictive bureaucrat, or acknowledge a miracle. He looked from Elias's stony face to Alistair's sputtering rage. He let out a long, weary sigh. "I think," Sheriff Gable said slowly, his voice heavy with authority, "that we've made a mistake, Mr. Alistair. This is a family matter. It ain't county business." The standoff was over. The law had just chosen a side. Alistair stared at Sheriff Gable, his mouth agape, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "A mistake? Sheriff, this man is a kidnapper. He has concocted this. this preposterous story to defy the law. Are you going to let him get away with it? Gable dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked over to Elias, his gaze filled with a newfound respect. He ignored Alistair completely. "Elias," he said, his voice low. "Is it true? All of it?" Elias met his gaze and nodded once. "It's true, John. My boy has come home." Gable looked towards the house, where the curtain in the front window had moved slightly. He could just make out the small silhouette of a child. He had known Elias Thorne his whole life. He had seen him consumed by grief, a walking ghost for 10 years. Now he saw a man transformed, a man filled with a purpose so fierce and powerful it was almost a physical force. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any court order, that Elias was telling the truth. "Well, I'll be," Gable breathed, shaking his head in wonder. He turned to face the apoplectic Alistair. "I've seen all I need to see. There's no runaway here, just a boy who's finally found his way home. We're leaving, Alistair." "You're a fool!" Alistair shrieked. "I will report this. I will go to the judge. I will have your badge for this." "You do that," Gable said, his voice flat. He was a man who had been pushed too far, his innate laziness overcome by a sense of decency he had almost forgotten he possessed. "You tell the judge how you tried to take a man's son from him, the son everyone thought was dead. See how that plays out for you." He walked to his horse, his message clear. The matter was closed. "Elias, this isn't over, Thorne," he spat, his voice a venomous whisper. Then he mounted his horse and galloped away, his fury trailing behind him like a dark cloud. Sheriff Gable paused before leaving. "Elias," he said, tipping his hat, "welcome back." He then turned his horse and trotted away, leaving Elias standing alone in the quiet afternoon. The battle was over. The war was won. Elias turned and walked back to the house. When he opened the door, Samuel was standing right there, his small face etched with worry. "Is he gone?" "He's gone," Elias confirmed. "He's not coming back." Relief washed over Samuel's face so profound that his knees seemed to buckle. Elias caught him, lifting him up into his arms. The boy was light, but he felt solid, real. He was home. He was safe. The weight of the last few weeks, the tension of the impending fight finally lifted from Elias's shoulders. He carried his son to the rocking chair, Elara's chair, and sat down, holding him close. The house was quiet again, but it was a new silence. It was the silence of peace, the silence of sanctuary. It was the end of a long and terrible storm. They had weathered it together. They had faced the world and won. Looking out the window at his fields, at the newly turned earth of the garden, at the vast open sky, Elias felt a sense of hope so powerful it was almost painful. For 10 years he had been a man living in an epilogue. He had thought his story was over, but he had been wrong. This was not the end. It was the beginning. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the lonely farmer. He was Samuel's father, and their story was just getting started. Years passed. The farm, once barren, now thrived under the care of 2 pairs of hands. The fields were green with corn and golden with wheat. The vegetable garden overflowed with produce. The farmhouse, once a shell of sorrow, was filled with the sounds of life. The quiet conversations of a father and son, the sound of shared work, the occasional, precious sound of laughter. Samuel grew from a small, haunted boy into a strong, capable young man. The shadows never fully left his eyes. Some griefs are carried for a lifetime, but they were tempered by the light of a loving home. He learned the ways of the land from his father, his hands growing as calloused and capable as Elias's own. He spoke freely now, his voice confident and clear, though he often chose a comfortable silence, the shared language he and his father had first learned. The town's suspicion had long since turned to a quiet, respectful awe. The story of Elias Thorne and his long-lost son became a local legend, a tale of miracles and faith rewarded. Sheriff Gable became a regular visitor, stopping by for coffee and conversation, his presence a symbol of the community's acceptance. Alistair was never heard from again, his threats dissolving into the empty air. The carved birds, the 2 talismans that had brought them together, sat side by side on the mantelpiece, nestled next to the photograph of the smiling woman who was the beginning and end of their story. They were a constant reminder of the incredible journey that had led them to this peaceful life. One warm summer evening, Elias and Samuel sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. Samuel was a young man now, tall and strong, his father's son in every way that mattered. "Do you ever miss her?" Samuel asked quietly, his gaze on the horizon. Elias didn't have to ask who he meant. "Every day," he replied, his voice soft. "But I see her in you, in your strength, in your kindness. She's not gone, Samuel. She's right here." He placed his hand on his son's shoulder. The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was full of love, of shared history, of a bond forged in sorrow and tempered in hope. For 10 years, Elias Thorne had believed his life was over. He had been a man waiting for the end, but a small, silent boy had appeared in his barn and taught him that love is a force stronger than death, that family is a circle that can be broken but never truly severed. The lonely farmer had taken in a homeless boy, and in doing so had found the son he never knew he had lost. But the real truth, the truth that settled in his heart as he watched the last light fade from the sky, was that the boy had also saved him. Samuel had come looking for a home, and in finding it, he had rebuilt his father's soul.